First, set your screen to speaker view.
Okay, and then I'm going to shift my view to speaker view. And now as I talk, now I'm seeing you, Danny. Although, okay, now I'm seeing me. So I think everybody should be muted except me, maybe one or two of the co-hosts. And we're recording this at this point. So I'm going to adjust this a little bit. Okay, so welcome to everybody. This is the first session of this series where we're going to be let's see. Where we're going to be exploring the Situationist International. And I'm going to start off with a few minutes of preliminary remarks. And then we'll get to the main part of the program. Because of all the people here, as I think you know, we can't really have a discussion group. We're going to have more of a, webinar or seminar kind of thing where I'll give presentations, talk about the text a little bit, and then we'll shift to Q&A, and then I'll talk about other texts, Q&A, and so on, going back and forth like that. I hope you'll bear with me. I've facilitated a lot of smaller groups, but I've never done a group of this size in this Zoom format. So I have three or four friends co-hosting here, and Kim will be dealing with the Q&A with the raised digital hands kind of deal. And Danny will be monitoring the chat so that you can also type in questions in the chat as well as any other things you might have. And Peter will be overseeing the whole operation, hopefully, taking care of any technical issues that may come up. And you can also, in the chat, you can email a chat to Peter Maravelis if you have some question about how, you're having problem getting your Zoom connection or whatever. There's a wide variety of people here, and some of them are from other countries. They come from different backgrounds, and some of them are kind of old hands at this. They've been reading the Situationists for decades and may even have been involved in some related activities. And a lot of you are totally new or pretty new. And so I'm just mentioning this so that I'm going to try to talk to everyone. So please bear with me if I say some things that are kind of obvious, and I may at times say things that seem a little bit complicated or something you don't know about. Hopefully, as we go through the series, you'll, like, if you're fairly new at it, just listen to what I say and listen to the questions, and you'll get some idea of the issues that the Situationists were dealing with. Let me adjust this a little bit more, hopefully. As you noticed, we're recording these sessions. So I plan to post the recordings online, maybe at YouTube or Vimeo or someplace like that later on, so that other people can see them later. including people who are in Europe or India or other places who've expressed interest, it would be in the middle of the night for them. But this is another reason when we get into the Q&A, just to keep things simple, no inflammatory rhetoric and heated debates and all this kind of thing. Don't say anything you wouldn't want it to be heard by all sorts of people next week or in the years to come. And in any case, in the Q&A, or in the readings, don't expect simple answers as to exactly what the Situationists said we should do to change the world. They were just a small number of people attempting to grapple with the entire global social, political, economic order that's dominated us people for centuries. And if the answers were simple, we wouldn't be here talking about these issues today. People would long ago have created a utopian society, and we would have many other more fun and interesting things to do. But that's not how it worked out. And still, even as things are, I think one of the more interesting things to do is investigating these possibilities. As one of the May 68 graffiti put it, in a society that tends to abolish all adventure, the most interesting adventure is to abolish that society. So we'll be proceeding roughly chronological through the Situationist International. And in my follow-up email tomorrow, I'll send you the readings for the next several months. Mostly we'll be focusing on the text in the SI anthology. SI is Situationist International, SI anthology, but at times I may refer you to other texts or to maybe screen share a few images from May 68 or Situationist comics or Guy Debord's films, something like that. So we'll also be looking at the format of these Zoom sessions from not just a technical angle, but like, what is this? What's its limits? The Situationists were notorious for their blunt refusals to engage in lectures and interviews and various other types of pseudo communication. A one-way Q&A format is definitely not something that they normally did. So there could be predictable jokes about how I'm making a spectacle of myself, yakking away before a captive audience of spectators and so on. For now, I'm just going to say there's some element of truth to that kind of criticism, but it's not that simple. Guy Debord wrote a book critiquing the, quote, Society of the Spectacle, but he also made several films. One of those films was a film of the book, Society, the Spectacle. So the spectacle that he's talking about in The Situationist is a more subtle and complicated thing than just denouncing images or spectators. And as we proceed through the Situationist writings, we'll come upon some texts where they go into exactly those issues, why they're doing this and not that. As far as the overall goal is concerned, the Situationists insisted that the whole point of their project was a radical global revolution, nothing less. And so if we understand that, that's not the point of this series. Our goal here is simply to better understand what they said and did, not to organize some sort of political action or to debate different political strategies. The Situationist ideas have obvious implications for all sorts of social issues and social struggles, and those will inevitably come up. People will say, well, what does that have to do with global warming or Black Lives Matter or, you know, whatever. But our purpose here is just to look at what they said and did. And what you do with that is up to you. So I'm going to start out saying a few words about myself so how I got into this picture. And this picture keeps changing a little bit. So I was raised in Missouri, went to college in Illinois, and came to Berkeley in 1965. And that was right in the middle of all the 60s stuff, you know, psychedelics, rock bands, trips, festivals, hippie communes, the works, and things that the 60s were famous for. And I was right in the thick of all that, and also in the various new left things that were going on at the time, civil rights movement, protests against the Vietnam War, Black Panthers, and so on. And so I was going through that in, you know, the mid to late 60s out here in Berkeley, where I still am. And a friend and I, after we had gone through that, by the time we got to about 1969, we had become rather disillusioned by the authoritarian tendencies and even Stalin tendencies in the New Left. And we had become anarchists. And so this was like a little step outside of the mainstream there a little bit. We might still go to, you know, a protest march or something like that, but we were looking a little bit more askance at, oh, that speaker is in this leftist group, and, you know, how they're manipulating people or the party lines and stuff like that. So anyway, as we were reading anarchist stuff, which kind of gave us this somewhat different slant, we came across a few mentions of this obscure and mysterious little group called the Situationist International that had apparently, you know, helped to inspire or trigger the May 1968 revolt in France. And at that time, we had never even heard of the Situationists, and hardly anybody else in America had either. Most of their stuff was in French, and but we did find a couple of their pamphlets that had been translated into English in a Berkeley bookstore. And when we read them, we were shocked. We were used to all the usual leftist stuff, including anarchist stuff, but this, compared with those kind of platitudinous propagandistic rhetoric, it seemed like the Situationists were like from another planet. You know, it was like they were just much more concise, and you know, reading some of their sentences was just like a twist of the knife. You know, I said, whoa, what's going on here? And so then we discovered there was a little situationist group in Berkeley, and we met them. And that was a volatile encounter, and inspired by them or provoked by them, my friend and I started experimenting with our own, doing leaflets, kind of disruption kind of things, and things that we thought were sort of what we understood that the Situationists did, or what this little group we had met did. And in the process, over that next year, that would have been the year 1970, we got in touch with a lot more situationist or situationist oriented people locally and around the world. And we, you know, started collaborating on different projects and so on. And we also, I in particular, but some of the others also started learning French so we could read the Situationists, because most of their stuff wasn't in English. And in 1971, I went to Paris for the first time and met a lot of the Situationists in and out of the Situationist International. And, you know, over the next, continued over the next decade, I was kind of in and out of various groups and projects. And my French improved. so I ended up doing this first version of the Situationist International Anthology, the first edition of what we're reading today. And also made several other trips to Europe and one trip to Japan and Hong Kong. And then, time went by. In 1990, I wrote a little book about Kenneth Rexroth, the radical writer and social critic, another big influence on mine. And in 1997, I put out this book called Public Secrets, which was a collection of my previous writings plus two new writings. One was called The Joy of Revolution, which was kind of a look at the pros and cons of different radical tactics, and also includes some thoughts about what a global situationist type revolution would look like. And also an autobiography called Confessions of a Mild-Mannered Enemy of the State, which goes into my situationist encounters and ventures in a lot more detail than I am here. And in 1998, I started the Bureau of Public Secrets website, where you can find all my writings and translations, and continued to do translations and my own writings. In 2001, Debord's widow, Alice Debord, asked me to make a translation of Guy Debord's complete film scripts, which I did. And then a few years later, I did an annotated translation of Debord's Society of the Spectacle. And I continued doing some of my own writings, and most notably, a lot of writings during the 2011 Occupy movement, in which I was an enthusiastic participant. And so a few of my writings criticize the Situationists in a few points, but the disagreements are mostly pretty minor. Even in the few cases where I disagree with them, I think that I can explain what they wrote and why. Anyway, that's what I'll be trying to do in this series, and I hope you'll find it both informative and provocative. So that's the end of the introductory stuff, and now I'm going to talk about our our readings for today. We're beginning with 7 pre-situationist texts by some people or groups that led up to the formation of the SI in 1957. And I'm going to do them in 3 different parts. The first 3 texts we'll do all together are all center around urban psychogeography. And the 4th text will be the second thing about the détournement, that kind of strange subversive tactic that they more or less invented. And the last 3 will be our third thing that has to do with various avant-garde groups that led up to the formation of the Situationist International. So on the first 3 texts, focusing on urban psychogeography, remember that, bear in mind that we're talking about just a few people, mostly in Europe, who had just finished going through World War II. So not only had Europe been physically, devastated by the war, but, it seemed to many people like virtually all the old ideologies had just lost all credibility. It was like, what's happened here? This is crazy. And so these early situationists, they didn't yet have the group and didn't have that name, but like we're talking about late 40s or early 50s. They looked back on things like Dadaism and Surrealism with some interest, but they felt that those 2 movements had failed to change the world, which was the intention of those movements. What they did not intend just to be an art school or something like that. And so they really felt like we're starting from scratch here. Everything is a mess. Where do we go from here? So they just start with their own lives in their where they're living. In this particular case, Paris, but some of them in other cities in Europe. And they're bearing in mind the past, like Surrealism, Dadaism, the World Wars, the various revolutions that had not succeeded, or that had succeeded, like in Russia, and turned out to be worse than than anything. They're looking over all that and saying there's very little of the past that we can relate to here. We just find an occasional little event here and there. We've got to start from, just from nothing, right where we are. And so one of the places that they were, like in Paris, they're in this pretty interesting city, where a lot of things are going on, and they are not interested in most of the things that are going on, but at least there is a lot of stuff happening, interactions of different currents of ideas about life and how to change life and so on. So so these people, like, I could kind of sum them up like they were young people, kind of wild, irresponsible, disreputable type bohemians in Paris. And they might be considered somewhat comparable to like the original beat people in America right around that same period. There was a lot of differences too, but if you look at kind of their lifestyle, it was a pretty out of the ordinary sort of group of people. So the first text we're looking at is called Formulary for a New Urbanism by Ivan Shcheglov. And this text is such a marvelous creation, filled with such an astonishing variety of novel ideas and sometimes zany fantasies about the possibilities that could happen if you had a different kind of urban environment. What could you do with it? And I'm not even going to try to go through what Shcheglov says here. I mean, there's so many gem of quotes and all this, but I am going to talk about him as a person because that kind of connects with who these people were. He was a close companion of Debord in the early 50s, and Debord credits him with being a really visionary innovator on this terrain of what came to be called psychogeography. So he and Debord and a few others pioneered the practice of dérives, which we'll talk to more about next session, which literally means drifting. It's like a practice, kind of a surrealistic practice of just letting yourself wander and see what happens through the streets without any preconceived goals. So he and Debord and these other folks are experimenting with those. And as Debord says in a later text, which we'll talk about it next session, he says, although dérives are usually just a day or two, quote, one sequence of dérives was pursued without notable interruption for around 2 months. Such an experience gives rise to new objective conditions of behavior that bring about the disappearance of a good number of the old ones. So you have to get the impact of this thing, if you really get into it, would be as impactful as a LSD trip or something like this. It's like you get into it and it's just disorienting. You're in a wonderland, or are you going crazy, or what's. And so later on, many years later, Shcheglov is writing a letter to Debord and Michelle Bernstein, Debord's wife, and he mentions this same experience. Quote, in 1953 to 1954, we dérived for 3 or 4 months straight. That's the extreme limit. It's a miracle it didn't kill us. And it didn't kill them, but it perhaps contributed toward driving Szczeglow insane, because he went insane not long after that, I think in the mid-50s or so. And he spent the rest of his life in an insane asylum. So it's like, I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of people like Antonin Artaud or, various people that the surrealists sort of hearkened back to that just really got into this trip of whether it was aesthetic or something else, and they just got totally disoriented. So in 1978, this is 25 years later, Debord, in his last film, which was an autobiographical film, is reminiscing about this period where they're doing these dérives and these things in the early 50s. And in that film, he's narrating it. He comes upon this passage. But can I ever forget the one whom I see everywhere in the greatest moments of our adventures? He who in those uncertain days, he's talking about Szczeglow, opened up a new path and forged ahead so rapidly, choosing those who would accompany him. No one else was his equal that year. It might almost have been said that he transformed cities and life merely by looking at them. In a single year, he discovered enough material for a century of demands. The depths and mysteries of urban space were his conquest. The powers that be, with their pitiful falsified information that misleads them almost as much as it bewilders those under their administration, have not yet realized just how much the rapid passage of this man has cost them. But what does it matter? The names of shipwreckers are only writ in water. We did not seek the formula for overturning the world in books, but in wandering, ceaselessly drifting for days on end, none resembling the one before. Astonishing encounters, remarkable obstacles, grandiose betrayals, perilous enchantments. Nothing was lacking in this quest for a different, more sinister grail, which no one else had ever sought. And then one ill-fated day, the finest player of us all got lost in the forests of madness. Szczeglow. But there is no greater madness than the present organization of life. Did we eventually find the object of our quest? This is still Debord in the film. There is reason to believe that we obtained at least a fleeting glimpse of it, because it is undeniable that from that point on, we found ourselves capable of understanding false life in the light of true life. End quote. In the next article, Introduction to a Critique of Urban Geography, Debord himself comes in and talks about some of the same things that Szczeglow was talking about. And he elaborates on Szczeglow's point about developing a new type of propaganda in favor of new types of desires. Debord notes that though the dérives and other psychogeographical experiments were just done by a few individuals, he stresses that ultimately, quote, nothing really new can be expected until the masses in action awaken to the conditions that are imposed on them in all domains of life and to the practical means of changing them, unquote. So to that end, Debord goes on, we need to flood the market, even for the moment merely the intellectual market, with a mass of desires whose fulfillment is not beyond the capacity of humanity's present means of action on the material world, but only beyond the capacity of the old social organization. The first of these means is undoubtedly the systematic provocative dissemination of a host of proposals tending to turn the whole of life into an exciting game. Combined with the constant depreciation of all current diversions. To accomplish this, we can envision an adroit use of currently popular means of communication. And what he's talking about there is, among other things, the tactic of détournement, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. Then in the third article we're dealing with right here, proposals for rationally improving the city of Paris, 4 leftist international members manifest a healthy and amusing magnanimity. Instead of just taking for granted the the urban environment that they're in, or just complaining about it or something like that, they sit down like as if they do a thought experiment. What would we do if it was in our control? And so here are the 4 of them as it's reported in this little Letrist International newsletter. With regard to churches, and bear in mind, by the way, with regard to churches, the Situationists, like practically every European radical in the last 2 centuries, detested religion, all kinds of religions, but particularly the Catholic Church. So that's where they're coming. To them, that's such an obvious thing, they don't even go into it. With regard to churches, 4 different solutions were proposed at this meeting, all of which were considered defensible until appropriate experimentation can be undertaken, which should quickly demonstrate which is the best. Guy Debord argued for the total destruction of religious buildings of all denominations, leaving no trace and using the sites for other purposes. That's one. Gil Woolman proposed that churches be left standing, but stripped of all religious content. They should be treated as ordinary buildings, and children should be allowed to play in them. Michel Bernstein suggested that churches be partially demolished so that the remaining ruins give no hint of their original function. The ideal solution would be to raze churches to the ground and then build ruins in their place. The first method was proposed purely for reasons of economy. Lastly, Jacques Fillon favored the idea of transforming churches into houses of horror, maintaining their current ambience while accentuating their terrifying effects. Everyone agreed, all 4 of these people, that aesthetic objections should be rejected, that admirers of the portals of Chartres should be silenced. Beauty, when it is not a promise of happiness, must be destroyed. And what could be more repugnant representations of unhappiness than such monuments to everything in the world that remains to be overcome, to the numerous aspects of life that remain inhuman? So now let's go to Q&A for regarding those first 3 texts. And there are 2 ways that you can ask a question. One is that you can raise your digital hand, and the other is by typing your question into the chat. So co-host Kim, who has just appeared on our screen, will watch for the raised digital hands. And when he calls on you, he'll click to unmute you, but then you have to unmute yourself. What he will do is just okay for you to unmute it, and then ask your question. And I encourage you to be brief, just a question, not a spiel or an autobiography or something. You can probably ask just about any question in 30 seconds. I mean, a minute would be stretching it. And then that way we can have time for lots of different questions. And then at a certain point, I'll call on Danny, and he will let me know if there's some questions in the chat. So again, I remind you, this is being recorded, so don't show anything inflammatory. And in any case, you shouldn't have time to be inflammatory because you just need to ask a question and then we can get on from there. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so we have 4 hands raised so far. Edward, Judy, Bruce, and Mitchell. So we'll start with you, Edward. And I'm trying to ask you there to unmute.
It's not really a question. It's just to let people know, you may be aware of these 2 new books that have come out over the last couple of years on Ivan Chechklov. I'll just hold up the covers. I don't know how well you can see them, but this is one of them here. And this is called Profil perdu, so Lost Profile is one. And the other one is this book here, which I'll just pull back. And again, on Chechklov, called Found Writings. Now, this particular copy or this book has a longer version of the essay that Ken was alluding to. Not by much. It was just to point out that Debord had trimmed a little bit for it to fit into the first issue of the Situationists. I believe that's where it first appeared. But I just want to point it out for those of you that find...
Actually, the anthology we're using has the full version in it.
Okay, so it does.
In the new thing, I translated that one you're talking about. So,
okay, excellent. Because anyway. For me, I thought this was the newest one, but these 2 books, if you're interested in Chechklov, are extremely good.
Thank you. On to the next one. Kim?
Yeah, I'm okay there. That ask to unmute function doesn't always work the first time.
Now, actually, Peter, I have a question for you. I'm seeing Kim full screen and not me full screen.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm seeing you full screen. So is there some way where we can have a sort of share screen between me and the person asking the question?
Yeah, let's we could do that. Sure.
Okay.
Let me work on that. So yeah, let's deactivate them first, or get them into the room first. Let's unmute them.
Hey, Judy's unmuted.
Okay, let me find Judy. Okay.
Can I ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know much about the Situationists, and maybe I'm naive, but is that a joke to destroy all the religious buildings? I'm thinking of Notre Dame, Chartres, all the cathedrals. I mean, those were built by people, working people died building those monuments. It seems like such arrogance and such disdain for working people to talk like that.
Okay.
Am I missing something?
That's a good question. And no, you're not missing something. The Situationists were very arrogant and they were serious. They detested religion. And they felt that these things, they would no more want to preserve them than they'd want to preserve Auschwitz or something.
Well, I detest religion too, but really you got to give the builders some credit there.
Well, it doesn't, they would say this credit schmetter, you know, lots of builders built all sorts of stuff. And if the effect of the things is negative, which they considered it was, that this went hand in glove with burnings at the stake, religious wars killing millions of people, and continue, you know, all sorts of, I won't even go into all these things. For them, this was just the epitome. This was the ultimate bullshit. And we're talking, of course, it's a joke in the sense that those 4 people were not in control of this and would never be in control of this. If what they're talking, the kind of revolution that we're talking about would happen, it would be masses of people deciding what are we going to do with Notre Dame or something, and not them. But they're saying, what if it was up to me? And Debord is saying, I say, obliterate them all. And then Michel Bernstein says, no, let's leave some ruins or something, you know, or let's something. So
well,
they're playing around with they have zero respect for religion, and they couldn't give a shit if it upsets somebody. They're saying what they think they would do if it was up to them.
Can I just add that during the French Revolution, there was a short period where Notre Dame was repurposed, and there was actually sex orgies in the, main part of it. So they could always be repurposed.
Well, that notice that one of the other people did say, they suggested, let's repurpose this. Kids can play in there.
Ken, we've got a lot of questions.
Okay, on to the next question. Bruce Ellen.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of us, ahead of where we are, but there were references in the text that I read about the revolutionary or insurgent movements of 1956, which I take to mean that the workers' councils movement and the uprising in Hungary and a similar type of movement that existed in Poland
Yes.
earlier in that year, and you could also reference the East German uprising in 1953, which saw workers' councils emerge all over East Germany. And I really didn't get any sense of what the situation is made of those developments and their outcomes.
We will come to that. Like those things were contemporary, so they're just kind of mentioning them in passing as promising developments. But
I ask about that because at university I was a major in Soviet East European studies, and I studied, and my focus was on worker resistance within the Soviet bloc. So I mean, those are events that are of particular interest to me, and the fact that Situationists gave them such importance, interests me.
They were very interested in that, and in fact, we will have articles we'll be dealing with in some future meetings, where they have a whole article about the Prague Spring thing in 1968, and
there were workers' councils there as well.
Pardon me?
There were workers' councils. Workers' councils also emerged in the context of the Prague Spring as well.
So anyway, there are articles that talk about exactly what you're talking about, but they come up much. We'll be getting there in 2 or 3 months. Next question.
Oh, hey, so I was curious about the idea of geography and whether it had been these ideas had been applied to nature. I mean, it's very much an urban theory, and it's sort of the concrete jungle sort of thing. But in this essay, he's saying geography is the determinate action of general natural forces. Psychogeography is the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, organized or not, on the emotion and behavior of individuals. And whether anybody in the situationist context was thinking of natural geography or applying this to nature.
I don't think they were very much. Most Europeans, and anyway, most urban Europeans are mostly focused on cities, and they think that's where the interesting things are going on. Not that they have anything against going out in the country and taking a stroll or, doing other things, but for the most part, they were urban people. And so their focus was on cities. So you might have somebody else, I mean, that have different tastes and might talk about that. But even people that have more of a taste for nature or something have to admit that the stuff that's going on is going to happen in the city. It's not going to just be wandering around the countryside or something. It's the city where you're having adventures, you're meeting people of different cultures. I mean, if you look at the French Revolution or something, it's like what happens in Paris, and then that sort of floats out from other parts of the country. So what they're talking about, they're sort of assuming that this is urban, but they want different kinds of conglomerations rather than the existing cities. Thank you. It's a good point. Mike Bellard.
Mike, would you unmute yourself?
Yeah, he's done it. Go ahead, Mike. Or it looks like you're unmuted.
Yeah. I unmuted him.
Mike, it looks like your audio is turned off. You need to activate your audio, Mike. Maybe we can move on to another question.
yeah.
Mike, if you want to post your question in the chat, we can pull it from there.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Mike.
Yeah. Okay, we have Steen next.
Hi. So going back to the relationship with the churches and whatnot, I may be jumping ahead a little bit here, but are there any cultural touchstones in the past that the Lettrists and later the Situationists actually revered or viewed with respect, or was it more of a burn it all down completely perspective?
Well, it was close to the burn it all down completely, but there were some times where obviously when they looked back to the Middle Ages, there were peasant revolts and stuff like that that were in the name of religion, but they can nevertheless say, well, these are people trying to do a full-scale overthrow of the system that they're in, and if they're speaking like we're implementing the will of God or something like that, that's sort of more or less irrelevant. We can still look at that with interest, but in general they were pretty anti-religion. I mean, at a later point, we can come up with this. I actually wrote a pamphlet in 1977 called The Realization and Suppression of Religion that was precisely about the Situationists' attitude to religion. And I raised these other things. I said, well, I agree with most of what you're saying here, but don't you think that there's some kernels of something here, that I kind of made it analogous, like you have a critique of art, but you're not saying that art is just total bullshit. You're just saying art is creative, but it's too limited. But we want creative to spread. So I was saying there's kind of analogous things with religion. You can say religion is full of bullshit, but there's some things that are going on there, sort of, you might say spiritual things or things about ethical things, or people relate something that people talk about in religious terms. It's.
I was actually asking in a more broad sense, not just religion, but broader cultural structures, that sort of thing. Religion only being one example of them. They seem to want to get rid of a lot of old forms of art as well. And I'm wondering if there's anything outside of the religious references that they actually care about. I mean, forgive my phrasing.
Again, their concern is what can we do now with it? But in that regard, there are times where they'll look back at some historical event, including cultural things like a cultural movement in Renaissance France or, whatever. And they'll say, this is interesting. We should look into this. And sometimes like people like Debord did look into the Fronde, for example, which was this kind of funny revolutionary movement in France around the time of Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th, that he actually, Debord explored this with interest, even though it had nothing to do with proletarian revolution or something, because it had a certain flavor about it, a certain spirit of it that he liked. And he sort of savored that. And so he may end up quoting some, thing from that thing 4 centuries ago in a different context. And it's like, oh, yes, the sense of play while revolting or something like this. And so, I mean, I think it goes without saying that a lot of cultural things are simply human things, and the Situationists had no problem with making love or enjoying wine and food or dancing or various things. It's just they're saying in the present context, this is either counterproductive or at least it's pretty piddling, and you're doing that little thing on the weekend so that the rest of the time you can go back to the factory and something. But for sure, I think one of the characteristics of the Situationists were that they were not totally negative. They said we're against culture in a certain sense, but not going back to less than culture, like just we want to go beyond it. And by beyond it, they mean, in a sense, sort of incorporating whatever is worth saving, but kind of bringing it into a new thing. So if they have cities here, once again, they're debating, is this worth saving? Well, no, we could do better than that. Or maybe something's worth saving, but we can change the use of it. So there are a lot of things in the past. When we get to talking next year, if we get to the Society of the Spectacle, Debord at a certain point goes through different past periods, ancient Greece, the Renaissance, various times, and kind of points out the things that were interesting about them. But it's obvious that we have to, jettison a whole lot of stuff about them. So it's not a question of just saying, let's add all these things together. They have to be freed from their limits. So thank you. It's a good question.
Mike has asked his question in the chat.
Okay.
He says, did Debord or the Sits do psychedelics such as mushrooms, mescaline, and so on? Apparently, Sartre had in the mid-30s. Also, Gaudi seems to have produced a lot of buildings which upended the flattened boxes of the bourgeoisie. And any Sit comment on Gaudi? I know he was a Catholic conservative, but...
Okay, so the psychedelics and stuff like that, I think that some of the Situationists took a moderate amount of drugs and others not so much. I think that some of them had those experiences, but they were not focused on them like the Beats were, for example, or something like that. They weren't really one of their members, Alexander Trocky, actually was a junkie in addition, but I'm sure he took all these other psychedelics and stuff like that too. And when they dealt with that, he was in danger of being arrested or something at some point, and they came out with a poster defense of Alexander Trocky, and they were saying the Situationists declare that drugs are a matter of utter unimportance. So I mean, that was in a certain context, but as far as Gaudi, I don't know. I mean, I don't recall hearing them mention. I think because he was a Catholic and blah blah blah, they probably were less interested in him, but they certainly were thoroughly aware of all these various architectural creative things that had been happening in the last century. So Nick is next. Nick, I think you're on.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could say a few words about these kind of fantastically radical points of departure for a new civilization in the formulary for a new urbanism. So he says a new conception of space, a religious or non-religious religious question, a new conception of time, counting from zero, various modes of temporal development, a new conception of behaviors, moral, sociological, political, legal. So, I mean, obviously, the new conception of space and time seems to have something to do with their practice of deriving. But I was wondering if, maybe you could just say a little bit about what they might have had in mind when they're talking about a civilization with a new conception of time, new conception of space.
I'm going to be very brief on that. I think, for one thing, Szczeglow is sort of, it's like, who knows what he had in mind to some extent. But also, some of that stuff, we wouldn't get it very much by talking about it here. At later times, when the situationists go into more detail about this, like Vanagem does it in the book, The Revolution of Everyday Life, a lot, and Debord goes into it in some of his writings, then you get a little more sense, like, what does it mean to get beyond time or have a different kind of time or something like that? Otherwise, I think all you can say from this is that he's saying, hey, the whole works is in question here. Who knows what we can come up with? We don't like what this thing is here, but there are infinite possibilities. I think that's, I think I'll let it go with that. Danny, do we have any other interesting chat questions?
There's been quite a lively interaction going on in the chat. People asking questions, some people answering them or commenting on them. I think I'm going to throw out this question. What do true life and false life mean for Debord in the excerpt you read?
Yeah, that's a real interesting point there. And I almost wanted to comment on that. He said, the quote is, from that point on, we found ourselves capable of understanding false life in the light of true life. He's talking about the psychogeographical stuff. But the same thing is true for any sort of experiments that one might do in a kind of radical way. It's that I think everybody's experienced this to some extent. But I know that sometimes when I've done something daring or experimental or something that sort of puts me, I've thrown myself into a situation where I don't know exactly what's going to happen and all that. Sometimes that is so exciting. Like it's just, it's like a game that is with your life. And you think, you might have started out just sort of by chance, like, oh, let's just try this. But when you're doing it, you say, this is the life, this is interesting here. And then when you come back from that, I mean, it's like taking an acid trip or something. You come back from that and you look at ordinary reality, so-called, and you see more clearly what's wrong with it. Like you don't take it for granted because you've seen that you could be different. You've been to a different place. And once you've been to that different place, you've had different kinds of relationships, different kinds of experiences. Then you go back to business as usual. And it's like, oh, God. I mean, it's not necessarily that. I mean, you may even go back to business as usual. And even that could be more interesting because you're looking at it in a different way. But the point is that you see the problem. Like if you're deriving, you start looking at buildings in a different way, instead of just saying, oh, there's the city hall and there's that big store and there's this stuff. You come upon them like if you were a Martian, you say, what is that? What function does that big thing have? And it may be that the function is completely stupid. And of course, it's stupid anyway, like most factories or offices and stuff like that. But this is like a gut feeling. It's like That is, instead of saying we went on a trip to see miraculous, unusual, exotic things, it's like you're looking at that building is exotic. What the fuck is it doing here? And yet it's a building that 1,000 people work in every day and all this without thinking about it at all, you know, and their lives, their minds, their bodies are affected by the office they're sitting in, by the path to the office, by the stuff that they're doing there, all that kind of thing. And they're so used to it that, you know, if somebody said, oh, there's the problem here, they say, huh? I mean, they might have a sense that they don't like it. They don't like their boss, or they find it boring or something, but they just sort of assume that that's the way things are. And if you do these things kind of like Derives or analogous other experiments, you don't take it for granted anymore. You say, okay, I agree, the building's there, and for the time being, I'm not able to do anything about it, or I would get arrested or something. But you now look at it more accurately. So I think that's.
And how are we doing on time?
I think we're ready to move on to the next stage. Thank you for the reminder.
And speaker view?
And speaker view for me. Okay, we got it here. And let's see, and we're already recording. So we'll go to the fourth article, is in a category by itself. It's by Debord and Gil Woolman. And these were two members of the Lettrist International, which I can't go into lettrism. It's too complicated and an obscure thing. But this was lettrism, which Debord mentions in a later article, was a little extreme avant-garde movement in Paris, primarily in the late 40s and into the 50s and on, actually. And Debord and Woolman and a few of these other people had been involved in it around 1951, 52, 53, that period. And then they had broken from it, again, for reasons I won't go into, just because it would be time consuming. But anyway, so they formed what they called a Lettrist International. So they were kind of saying, we're breaking from it, but we're carrying on this radical lettrist thing, but we're forming an international group. So those two people have written this article about this tactic called détournement. It's a French word, and as I note, it means, in French, it means deflection, diversion, rerouting, distortion, misusing, misappropriation, hijacking, or otherwise turning something aside from its normal course or purpose. Like if you hijack an airplane, they say they detoured the plane. If you embezzle funds, they say he detoured funds from his office. If you corrupt a minor, you've detoured a minor. So it has those kind of connotations, but basically it just means that you're turning something from its usual purpose. It's just like, so what they have done is that they haven't invented this exactly, but they've noticed that for the past century, people have been doing this kind of strange process where they take something and turn it to a different use, primarily in the arts. And so things like a collage is like you take a newspaper and you make the newspaper, a scrap of it, part of a collage. You know, so you're juxtaposing different things there. And so then they start, so we use that term has gotten anglicized because people like me and others use it that way. And it's a lot easier than just explain something like diversion. So they start off talking about arts and how like the very first sentence is, every reasonably aware person of our time is aware of the obvious fact that art can no longer be justified as a superior activity or even as a compensatory activity to which one might honorably devote oneself. So again, this is their right in their your face hyperbolic thing, but their point is that art as such, like creating art, creating a poem, a piece of music or whatever, they're saying that this is no longer, you know, maybe once it was a creative thing, it served this, but right now, you know, given how society has turned out, we don't give a shit about that anymore. What we are concerned about is using what is usable for our own purposes. And to do that, you can use a past artwork, you can use a comic, you can use a tune, you can use a phrase or something and put it in a different context. And that's the main gist of what this is. And then they go on to examine, I'm not going to go into detail this, but about various types of détournement and various ways that it works. Like there's the type of détournement where you just take something irrelevant and just use it. Or there's another kind where you take something, but it's not irrelevant. It's like a famous saying or a famous person or something. So that has a little different effect, because then the person reading the thing is sort of aware that you've misquoted Marx or you something like that. Anyway, there are various other kinds of détournement that I'm not going to go into here. We can keep this session pretty brief, but in the meetings to come, we'll be using a lot of examples from this. I'll be showing you situationist leaflets, comics, some excerpts from clips from Debord's films, you know, where he's détourning a film, where somebody is détourning a tune to make a different song out of a, you know, people do this all the time. But as Debord and Vollmann are saying, we don't claim to have invented this, but we propose to systematize it. And so they're looking back at this. And in this sense, they're not just doing this with art or with poetry or something like this, but in a way, it's the same issue about, do we destroy the churches or not? They're saying that some things from the past just merit being destroyed. But other things you can say, oh, that's great, you know. So then you might use that for a different purpose. Like we say, you take a nice church building, but it's used for a playground instead, or whatever. So I had a few things I'm going to share very briefly, kind of on these notes here. Let me see if I can go to here. Okay, I'm going to share screen. This is just if you're curious, this is a photo of 4 of the lettrists. From left to right, it's Gil Woolman, Mohammed Daou, Guy Debord, and Ivan Shcheglov. So this is them like in probably 1953 or something like that. And while I'm at that, I'm going to show you another photo of some of the people we'll see or have seen. Okay, this is 3 years later. This is Debord on the left, Michelle Bernstein, his first wife, in the middle, and Oscar Jorn, the renowned painter, on the right. And the 3 of these were among the founders of the Situationist International. And Jorn was actually, he's quite a famous artist still. But he and Debord were very different types of people, but they were really good friends. You know, they kind of complemented each other. Oscar Jorn was a very eclectic, open, you know, kind of guy who just met everybody and traveled around and all this. Debord was the more precise kind of thing. Not that he was not sociable, on the contrary, but he was the more focused type. And so the two of them, like, between the two of them, they gathered the people that we'll see in a few minutes later in some of these articles, these people from avant-garde groups around Europe, and then took it from there. So then, if I may be so self-indulgent, I'm going to okay, this is from my website. Let's see how we can do this. Really, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to. I think I'll leave it at this. I have a comic of Dagwood, and Dagwood and his family are talking about détournement. And so it's just an example of how putting something in a different context can change the whole tone of it. You know, because détournement is playful, but this really gets, I mean, the Debord and Volman thing may seem like a serious examination, but it's really just using things. So I will stop the share on that. And, you know, I think we'll go to Q&A directly for that, because we have one more longer thing after this. So if you have any questions about détournement, or any leftover questions from other stuff, we'll just have a few of those, and then we'll go to the final segment.
One from the chat, hasn't modern advertising begun using this technique as a weapon? I think they're talking about détournement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can, in fact, you can see some very subtle things that indicate they have obviously read the Situationists. I mean, there are even little Situationist slogans sort of blended in with something. But yes, the point of the Situationists was that, yes, people have been doing these things for a century, basically, and increasingly in recent decades. So you'll see comics change. I mean, you see that movie by Woody Allen called What's Up, Tiger Lily, which is just, I think it's it's some kind of Asian film or something with subtitles that make the film seem totally ridiculous. You know, and that's an example of détournement without any significance. You know, it's just détournement for a joke. But the Situationist René Viennet did the same thing with a Kung Fu movie and created this film called Dialectics Break Bricks. And that is a sort of Situationist détournement. So anyway, yes, ads are using this all the time. I mean, people are doing it in songs when they parody another song and so on. The difference is that what Debord and Volman are talking about is turning it to radical use. Not just turning it to a joke or turning it to commercial use or something like this. And that's a whole other matter. That's not just a question of making a joke about, you know, having some comics say something different. We have questions from Steen and Edward again.
This may just be a footnote to what you just said, but is it fair to say that the difference between détournement and recuperation is what side you're on, or are they fundamentally different processes?
Actually, that would be pretty close. I mean, you could say if somebody recuperates, which is just a French term for co-opt, basically. It's no need to get complicated there. When somebody co-opts something, it means they've kind of taken him into their camp. They've taken an oppositional spokesman and they've said, hey, you can be on our committee, as our, we can use your skepticism or something. And so in a way it is kind of inverse, because détournement is saying it's looking at all this stuff out there and it's picking something else that's, but in the case of that, you might say it is the good guys. It's like, can this be for a good purpose, i.e. a revolutionary purpose, a constructive, creative, radical purpose? Whereas co-option is typically the status quo is taking something in order to diminish anything that might possibly bother it.
Thank you.
Edward again.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding the way in which détournement has been sort of revisited. In the 1980s, there was the American artist Barbara Kruger. I don't know if you know her work at all. I'm just wondering if you would consider her to be someone who understood détournement and that critical edge that you talk about, especially in the introduction to Debord's films. That's where you explained it clearly. And when I look at Kruger's work, I see that same critical reflection. I show that in my class as examples. I was just wondering if you would have agreed.
Yeah,
if you agree with
no,
it.
I'm not familiar with. I mean, I know there are a few artists around that do sort of these things. My impression is that they're not doing exactly the same thing. But who knows? I mean, generally, détournement is not something that a painter does a series of things and it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, maybe you look at that and you say, oh, that's impressive. But usually détournement is very disruptive. I mean, it's not just a thing like, oh, that's an interesting image, blah, blah, blah. Détournement really pisses people off and it puzzles people, like they can't get their mind around it. And, they perceive it as a threat, or they just don't get it. Somebody's screwing with my mind here or something. It's not something that they would see at an art gallery. So anyway, John Curry.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, if you, and you might be unfamiliar with them, but like the Slovenian Yugoslavian art group like Laibach and NSK, because they had a long-term program where they kind of like reappropriated the mannerisms and aesthetics of like repressive state apparatuses, and then they turned that into like they would actually like issue passports, and like they would have these like these very elaborate set pieces for their concerts and stuff like that. And like when I first was exposed to it, I was wondering if that's determined, or if determined is more accurately described as like a single artifact, or like a single example of determined, like a single collage, or like a single comic that's been determined, or if determined is, like, in your experience, like, is it effective over time, or does the kind of the impact of the juxtaposition, does it start to attenuate the longer that like the joke keeps being said over and over, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the broader thing you're talking about, I mean, there might be things that have a long-term effect, or there might be sequences of determined or something. I don't want to get too technical about this. The gist of this is that they're taking things, they're plagiarizing things, they're taking things from one source and turning them perhaps into something very different. I mean, they might be quoting the Bible, but they're coming in the middle, or it's kind of irrelevant. So that's the main thing. People can get into elaborate things about how, oh, we're screwing with people's minds, or we're doing guerrilla war, mental guerrilla warfare or something like that. But in my experience, most of those kinds of things are too confusionist. It's just they're just kind of jumbling things up, and I don't see. Whereas when I see the situationist things, they really zero in on some point, you know, that is a rational point generally, but it has an emotional impact because they've got an image or something there. So I think we'll move on to the last section here, as we're running a little behind. And this, so I'm going to change my view. Okay, I've got speaker view. So I should be on the screen now only. Our last three pieces were three pieces about avant-garde organizations leading up to the formation of the Situationist International. And the one by Jorn, I'm not going to comment on it, just kind of briefly mentions various Peter, I'm only seeing John still. Is my image?
How's that?
Well, now I'm not seeing anything in the main thing.
Because we're seeing you.
Okay, if you're seeing me, that's fine. Well, still, I need to see me because it's recording. Okay, I guess this will do it. Like host had spotlighted me, and so let's see if we can.
And when you go to view, the little view drop down up top.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to put me full screen. Okay, there we go.
Do you have speaker selected in that drop down?
I already had speaker selected, and that wasn't doing it. So now for this, so that was a brief Oscar Jorn thing talking about the Bauhaus and these various artistic groups in the late 40s and early 50s. And then they had a meeting in 1956 in a little town in Italy called Alba. And at that meeting, Jorn and some of his friends, some, you know, various artist groups were there. And the letters delegate was Gil Woolman. And so when he was there, he outlined some of these, well, I mean, you can, you know, the parallel crises presently affecting all modes of artistic creation result from general interrelated tendencies and cannot be resolved outside a comprehensive general perspective. That sounds pretty abstract, but this is just reiterating the point that their concern with art, the arts or creativity and so on, is not to make it better, a different artistic school or better works of art or something. They're saying what we're interested in is the totality. So in that context, arts are just one bit of that. We're interested in creativity, which arts reflect, but we're interested in full creativity, not a limited creativity that just ends up in a painting on a wall or at a time in a 1 hour session at a concert or something like this, but that enters into people's everyday lives all the time and keeps going. So that thing, the Situationists called a situation. And that's where their name comes from, is that even before the Situationist International, they had been kind of hypothesizing, well, what do we do if we don't have create a work of art? Is that we create a situation, and a situation is something that's sort of open-ended and goes on. It's not just we're going to have a situation tomorrow between 4 and 5 or anything like that. So that's the gist of this. And then when we get to Debord's last article, which is the longer one, it's called Report on the Construction of Situations and on the International Situationist Tendencies, Conditions of Organization and Action. And in there, this is like the founding document of the SI. And Debord goes through, first of all, some of those cultural things that we've already noted. And then he becomes more specific about preceding avant-garde groups. And he says, there's a notable progression from futurism through Dadaism and Surrealism to the movements formed after 1945. At each of these stages, however, one discovers the same desire for total change and the same rapid disintegration when the inability to change the real world profoundly enough leads to a defensive withdrawal. So he then goes on briefly summing up these things. He says, futurism, basically, it adopted an attitude of revolutionizing literature and the arts, which produced a great number of formal innovations. And it eliminated the idea that to write a poem you had to write about nymphs and magical things and pretty landscapes or something like that. Like the futurist would have a picture of a machine or things like this. But he says, this was a simplistic kind of thing, and it rapidly just fell apart. Like this is, and he noted that the Italian futurist segued right into fascism with no problem. Then he mentions Dadaism, initiated in Zurich and New York by refugees and deserters from World War I, expressed the rejection of all the values of a bourgeois society whose bankruptcy had just become so grossly evident, namely in World War I. Its violent manifestations in post-war Germany and France aimed mainly at the destruction of art and literature, and so on. Its historic role is to have delivered a mortal blow to the traditional conception of culture. Its almost immediate dissolution was the inevitable result of its purely negative definition. But he says, even so, it's had a big influence on everything that came after it, because that negative aspect as well. It says Surrealism kind of came after Dadaism, and the Surrealists had originally been Dadaists in France. And they had a more constructive notion of revolt, and they were basing it on poetic application of Freudian psychology. Surrealism extended the methods it had discovered to painting, to film, and to some aspects of everyday life, which particularly interested Debord. But then he goes on to say some of the limits of surrealism, and I don't have time to go into here, but he's saying that surrealism was exemplary in a certain way. It kind of complemented Dadaism as being a positive creative project rather than just a demolition project. And then later in his pamphlet, Debord goes into the post-World War II things, the movement Cobra, which was a group in Northern Europe of artists, and the lettrists. And he mentions Bertolt Brecht, because Brecht's notion of theater includes an idea of undercutting the spectator, like the spectacle. So, in Brecht's plays, he'll have a character stand up and say, well, now the character I'm playing is a complete fool here. You should know that blah, blah, blah. And then we go back into that. That's kind of like a détournement in another way. It's like the unexpected character is saying words that then the audience is trained not to believe in that character. He says, I'm just a character up here, folks. I'm not Superman. I'm not the something, but there's something to be learned here. So in a way, détournement is sort of doing that with images and so on. And then towards the end of his pamphlet, Debord goes into a number of key situationist themes. And so we can talk about them in the remainder of our session. There's the idea of the construction of situations, which goes beyond works of art. There's the idea of unitary urbanism, which is kind of a city planning that would be not as stupid authoritarian city planning so that the businesses get the best deal or something, but a city planning that you would do like everybody would do to work out what would be an interesting city to live in. And so to do that, that's kind of a hypothetical thing, obviously. You don't have cities at your disposal. But these things like derives and other psychogeographical researches can kind of contribute to that, and is in that thing where I was answering that person about false life. You know, by those experiments, you get a little better idea about what you could hypothesize, what would be an interesting city. And so we've already seen that happen to some extent in his own way with the Chekhov article. And then he also talks about reorienting society around play rather than work, by which he means wage labor. Then he says, to wind up his thing, he says, he's giving them some, he says, we've had these groups coming together here, and he says, we have neither guaranteed recipes nor definitive results. We only propose an experimental research to be collectively led in a few directions that we are presently defining, and toward others that have yet to be defined. The very difficulty of succeeding in the first Situationist projects is a proof of the newness of the domain we are penetrating. Something that changes our way of seeing the streets is more important than something that changes our way of seeing paintings. Our working hypotheses will be re-examined at each future upheaval, wherever it comes from. So again, notice how tentative this is. These are very arrogant people who think they've got a lot going for them. But part of their arrogance is that we are tuned in to how much needs to be done. We've made a few openings here. We've made a few promising experiments. And now we're on to a new venture that's more collective. We've gathered different people, and we'll see how that goes. And during the next two sessions, we'll see how that goes with this new group, the Situationist International. It has a lot of tensions, a lot of divergences within it, and eventually it has a lot of explosions that come, personal explosions that come out of it. So at this point, let's go into the Q&A again. Anything about those last things or Situationists in general? And
so ZZ has the first question.
Okay.
Oh, I unmuted you. Try it again.
Great,
There.
thank you very much. And thank you so much, everyone, for putting this together. This is really exciting, and I'm happy to be here with all of you. I have two questions. One is a historical context about Francois Sagan and Sagan culture, and I'm just wondering if that is something worth revisiting now. I know nothing about it. And the second question, I really appreciate the genealogy that you gave of moving through futurism, Dadaism, surrealism, and the kind of exhaustion of that. And I'm wondering if that the exhaustion of formal invention and innovation that they were feeling in the aftermath of World War II, if that's a comparable situation to us with the internet technologies, or if we're in a moment that's opening up to innovation and experimentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. The Françoise Sagan, that was a mention that Debord made. She was a famous teenage novelist who became really famous. And the closest example is she became so famous that everybody wanted to do everything about her life. And it was really silly because, you know, her novels were no great shakes. It was just kind of silly. And nowadays, we wouldn't think anything of that at all because we're used to complete non-entities being, you know, millions of people are watching their every move and interested if they have a new hairdo or a new boyfriend or whatever. But in the 1950s in France, this was considered really weird, I mean, usually, so they mention that as an example of the low point of that culture has come to. It's just become completely idiotic. And from our angle, it's like things are a lot more idiotic now than that. But that's just their context is from their angle. This is just the epitome of how idiotic the whole culture is. As for the stuff about the internet and all that, I don't know. I think we leave that for future examination. The Situationists are mostly looking at arts and thinking this art has worn itself out. Novels, paintings, these kind of things. It's hard to do something new anymore. These things have been going on a long time. And when to do something new, you've got to do something really weird like Joyce did in Ulysses, or Proust did in Remembrance of Things Past, or, things like that. And it gets to a point where, according to the Situationists, this just isn't interesting anymore. The last thing we need is another bright new novel, avant-garde novelist or something. It's just stupid. We're interested in our lives, and this has nothing to do with that. It's just completely boring. So let's see. Did we have Steen? Okay.
Oops.
You need to, yeah.
I see. I was muting myself instead of unmuting. This may be too much of a tangent, and forgive my terrible pronunciation, but in terms of the lineage, do you see any connection between the Situationists and the Oulipo movement? I see a thematic link, but perhaps I am high.
Yeah, that was a kind of literary sort of movement in 50s France or so. I think they considered that an example of just sort of silly. I mean, it's mentioned in passing briefly. Debord at some point says, that you can create a movement just by saying, oh, let's write a novel without using the letter E, or, what the hell, so of course, some of the people that were in that, like Raymond Queneau, were somewhat interesting writers. I mean, they go back to, he was a surrealist in the 20s and stuff like that. And in fact, when one of the Situationist books, Vonneguem's Revolution of Everyday Life, was being presented to publishers, and they took it to Gallimard in 1967. And all the people who read the book, to say, should we publish this book? Most of them said, no, this is crazy, or something. But Queneau and one other person said, no, I think this is really interesting. And so they voted down the book. And then the next day, there was something about the Strasbourg scandal, which we'll deal later. And it was like the Situationists were suddenly on the front page of newspapers all over Europe. And so suddenly Queneau calls him back and says, hey, Mr. Vonneguem, submit your manuscript again. I think it might get a more favorable review this time. So not that Queneau was Situationist, but he was a bright enough guy to recognize, okay, this is a quality thing here. And but I think there's no connection beyond that. They just said that that's one of the zillion literary people are trying to come up with some new thing, Greg Lichtman. Yeah, no, you muted yourself again. There you go.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's thank you for doing this, Ken. It's a great honor. I picked up the original anthology in the early 90s. My question is / comment is to the thought of anarchism and how early on they're kind of dancing around this, taking a revolutionary approach without any ideology. So there were situationists, but no situationism. But
Right.
they're having to talk to an audience or to, these past movements which became very dogmatic and reified.
Right.
And I think the one, if I can just read briefly, where he says, "Our situations will be ephemeral without a future, passageways. Our only concern is real life. We care nothing about the permanence of art or anything else. Eternity is the grossest idea a person can conceive of in connection with his acts." So there is a very much a kind of ego killing type of thought behind all of this, and I think will obviously bubble up more and more, especially in Venegas and later on.
Yeah. In our coming sessions, we'll be going in, when we get to the actual situationist journals, they have articles where they talk about what is situationism, and they, is there such a thing as situationist art, and they have heated debates about that. And so that's to be continued. Any other questions? Danny, anything in the chat?
There's a lot going on in the chat. On how are we doing on time?
I think we've got about 15 more minutes.
Okay, there's a lot of people exploring the origin of the concept of spectacle. Here's something. Can you do a fantastic job of telling old silly situationist stories? Haha, thank you so much. Here, I'll ask this question. When the bottom 90% who establish social ownership and democratic control of the collective product of their labor and distribute it on the basis of need, we will start changing the architecture of the urban landscape. So how do you change the mindset of the bottom 90% to accomplish that level of agency? Seems the Cits may have thought that their endeavors might drive this movement.
Well, we have an example there of the May 68 movement, which is not a fulfilled example, but we had different situationist themes that came up there that resulted in 10 million people occupying factories. So I think it's safe to say that some of the situationist themes potentially resonate there. Now, in ordinary circumstances, of course, you could talk about the things we're talking about here, and the average person would say, "What the hell are you talking about? That's just crazy. That has nothing to do with anything." But when the times come, like in May 68, suddenly those things become more understandable, and then some of these themes come out. Anthony Hayes, got a question? Comment?
Hi, Ken. Thanks for this. Sorry, I was late. I mixed up the time, so I missed out on the beginning of this.
Okay.
Look, mine was more of a sort of comment on the another participant sort of brought up the question of Oulipo, and I suppose the only reason I raise this again, and perhaps this is in relation to the question of détournement and why the Situationists sort of found continuing to sort of like either repeat or chisel away at sort of artistic experimentation as a problematic thing, or something that was of no longer any particular interest. Sorry, I'm sort of a little bit garbled at this point in time. Look, the reason why I bring up Oulipo is there were more connections than just Queneau's sort of favoring Van Eyckham's Revolution of Everyday Life. For instance, a writer who became a famous member of Oulipo, Georges Perec, he was quite interested in the Situationists. In fact, he wanted to write a novel that was purely a novel of détournement in the 60s. And he encountered the Situationists through Henri Lefebvre's group that was at the CNRS, which Debord himself participated in as well in the early 60s. It was a working group on the critique of everyday life. And Perec came into contact with Debord and the Situationist ideas through that. But amusingly enough, Perec published a novel in 1965 called Les Choses, The Things, a story of the 1960s. And in it, he uses elements of Lefebvre and the Situationist critique of urbanism. And the Situationists were quite sort of Perec won an award for this first novel, and they upbraid him over this in the pages of the journal, I think in possibly the 10th issue in 1966. For just, using sort of these critical ideas in a purely sort of like, selfish, self-aggrandizing way, right?
Yeah.
I.e. to publish a novel and, win a literary prize and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean,
But
that's an example why they were not interested in that sort of thing. It's just...
No, they certainly weren't interested in it. But the reason why I'm sort of like raising this to a point is sometimes one of the things I think that's sort of like really hard to sort of like really get a grip on when you see the Situations rejecting sort of continuing artistic experimentation and so on and so forth, is this idea of the sort of impasse of sort of a cultural decomposition for them. The reason why the artistic avant-gardes are of no more interest to them is because their own sort of like decomposition, their experiments in formal decomposition have raised this question implicitly, and sometimes these sort of like questions become sort of more explicit. For instance, Debord's interest in the sort of surrealists, sort of like what interested him in the surrealists was not their artwork, but rather the fact that they were trying to live differently. Okay, they were trying to live sort of surrealistically. Okay, and this is I think an important thing to hold on to, is that they're not sort of like rejecting sort of artistic practice because they're not particularly interested in art or artistic forms and so on and so forth. It's because these larger questions that have been raised implicitly and less so explicitly by the formal by the earlier avant-gardes are, for them, this is not the discovery of the Situationists. These things are starting to emerge in and of themselves through the decomposition of cultural practices that has been carried out by avant-gardists. And so now it's the job of the Situationists to draw people's attention to this and to proselytize around this and try and elaborate this, and so on and so forth. And so it's interesting when you see people like Perec and Oulipo and others who sort of, they see some of these sort of things that are percolating around the Situationists, they take them up to an extent, but all they really want to do with them is to bring them back to artistic practices.
Thank you. I mean, that's why the Situationists are not interested in that kind of thing. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's not that they're oblivious to those things by any means.
Sure.
So any other questions?
Judy.
Oh, no, sorry, that was just a comment, an extended sort of rambling comment. So
Judy, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I'm sort of surprised because, like after World War I, there was all that literature of the lost generation and the disillusionment of civilization and blah, blah, blah. And you would think that these people who had been through World War II would have emerged with some more earnest desire to create something more, oh God, mankind is in such bad shape, let's try to like do something. I mean, I'm just kind of a little flummoxed by their
some people did, but it's just
what was it? What were the movements that were really more earnest?
I can't go into it. I mean, there were a zillion different things going on, but the net result was that they were more or less, not very much happened. And you can attribute certain political tendencies to that, and and all that. But the Situationists, or these people, early people we're talking about, were in that situation where when they look at the powers that be, whether it's socialist, communist, conservative, whatever, they see some differences, obviously, but they see that basically the whole thing is pretty bankrupt, and they're not looking there for solutions.
But how would you compare them with, say, someone like Sartre? He was a little more earnest.
You'll see when we get to the SI number 10, you'll see an article they have about Sartre. They despised him. And they make a good point that he is of utterly no interest. But we'll discuss that when we get to issue number 10, which will be about 3 or 4 months from now. Any other questions? Dave.
There was a comment. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
You can unmute yourself, Dave.
I just wanted to note, when you talked about this, I guess it was at our classics meeting, you said, so when you hear the word SI, you think of that stands for the Situationists International. But to put things in context, the Situationists International is named in the historical series of Communist International, followed by the Socialist International in like 1950 or something like that. These are big groups, right, hopefully, of people who are trying to organize massive revolutions and get certainly the Communist right. International in 1919. That's communist parties around the globe.
Right.
I'm just saying that you have to understand the Socialist International as, on one level, as a joke. They're playing.
The Situationists.
I mean, the Situationists as a joke. They're playing on this.
That's right.
Very name, they're playing on the idea of we are a worldwide organization of less than 100 people. So it's you can't take it as seriously when they say things like destroy all.
This is
they have no power, and they know it. They're not after power.
This is an example of détournement.
Right.
They're taking a slogan that has this connotation of these big historical movements, and they're using it for a movement that's got maybe 10 or 15 people in it.
Right. What they're saying is you can do anything you want with anything.
Yeah.
That's all they're really saying.
I mean, it was a real organization, and it was international, and its quality was Situationist International instead of blah, blah, blah. But of course, anybody who actually looks at it a little bit will say, oh, yeah, that's just a few people. Well, they're not pretending anything different. They're just.
No, but that's why it's a joke in the context of the pretensions of the Communist International and the Socialist International. Yeah. They have none of those pretensions.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, just like when I invented my name in 1973, Bureau of Public Secrets. And that's just me. But it sounds kind of funny. It sounds a little bit mysterious. What's a public secret or something? So I put out posters that said, da, 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 signed Bureau of Public Secrets. It doesn't mean I'm pretending, that I'm like the Federal Bureau of Investigation or something, whatever. It's just a name, but it does kind of indicate at the same time it's a joke and it's not a joke. I mean, when they say that, like I was investigating things about public secrets. And so I had a little card that says Special Investigator Ken Knabb of the Bureau of Public Secrets. So yeah, you can say that's a joke, but in a way it's not a joke because that's exactly what I was. I was saying I have adopted this project. I'm investigating this society. I'm investigating capital crime. I'm investigating, these kinds of things. And it's completely true. There's nothing wrong there. But yeah, so when Debord and Volman say that some of these things have a sort of comical aspect, that's what they're talking about. It's not that they're making a joke just out of nothing. It's that the pretensions and the thing where the letrists are debating whether to destroy the churches or not. You know, they're debating it as if, you know, this was this might happen tomorrow, depending on what decision they make. And of course, that's a zillion years away. That has nothing to do with anything. But they're treating it as if this mattered. You know, like what there's, and indeed, in retrospect, you can say, well, that did matter. What the ideas they were debating there had repercussions years later. People are still debating, do we destroy that or do we adapt it, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I think we better wind down now. We're about at the end. I want to thank you all for showing up, and hope to see you 2 weeks from now. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow, and that will have the readings for the next meeting, and also I'll probably have the tentative schedule for the meetings several weeks in advance. And you're because it's recorded and not, you know, you're welcome to invite any friends you think might be interested, but I suggest that you tell them to email me, so that way they get directly on the email list. And thanks for bearing with me. I know there's some probably awkwardnesses or things that I flubbed up in answering or something, but I hope some things were at least suggestive and provocative. And let me know if you have any, you can email me if you have any suggestions or criticisms about how the Zoom process went.
And since you're not seeing the chat, I'll tell you that there's lots of thanks going on in the chat.
Thank you. I'll be able to look at the chat after we close this down. So, but anyway, it's very gratifying to have this here, and I'm really sorry. Like, you know, in other circumstances, if this was a much smaller group, we could sit around. I mean, even in Zoom, but let alone if it was in person, we can sit around, you know, and really have a conversation, and it's much livelier. So I apologize for the sort of formality of having to go through these unmute yourself and all that, but I don't see any other way that we could get to, you know, to at least get some interaction going on here. So it's like a little bit of a discussion, even if it's vicarious with everybody else listening in or something. So anyway, thank you again, once again, and I hope to see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Ken.
So maybe you co-hosts can stick around, and we'll sort of go over any technical issues that might have come up. But I think things went pretty smoothly.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple little notes, but we can wait till people take off and then that stuff.
Okay, we're down to just a few people. So if you're not a co-host, you are welcome to take your departure now. And I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Some of you actually in my other group. But I very much appreciate your being here. So, Peter, you had some notes about what we
so I think we need to assign one person to unmute, because I think what was happening is like there were probably two of us doing it at once, and so one person would unmute and then the other person would mute because we were both hitting the same button.
Yeah.
So probably a good idea, like whoever chooses it to just be the one person to actually unmute.
Okay.
Because on my list of choices, it says ask to unmute. And actually, when I was clicking that, it wouldn't work. Most of the time, it wouldn't work the first time. I had to click it 2 or 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I thought either Peter was unmuting them or they were trying to unmute themselves. And then I was muting them back, or, you know, we were at cross purposes.
Yeah.
So that happened a number of times.
Yeah. And I think we also should mention in the chat to people that they do need to unmute themselves when unmuting them. They need to physically, run the cursor across the screen and press the button that appears in front of them. Otherwise, we won't hear them. So I think we actually need to probably post that, make that one posted in the chat. Yeah.
So just ask them to unmute themselves.
Yeah. Any other things you noticed?
I would like to propose that we actually enable the audio between 4:30 and 5, because people show up, you say hi to them, you may say something about them, and then everybody's muted, including that person. They can't say hi back. And then we all sit there in silence until the next thing. And I think it'd be more convivial if the chat were enabled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. The problem is that if like 50 people are unmuted and talking, it's like
it'll be abject chaos. And being, having had that happen at City Lights during, it was, I think the New Directions anniversary party we had 2 years ago. We had quite literally like 12 people speaking that event, and we unmuted them in the green room, and it became very chaotic very, very quickly, because a lot of them had a lot to say to each other, and so we kept like they hadn't seen each other in years.
That's what
It became cacophonous.
Well, also today we were thinking there might be well over 100 people. There were less, but still 60 is quite a few people.
Yeah.
So, but
I think,
everybody was just sort of sitting there for quite a while. I mean, Daniel brings up a good point, but so does Peter. So I don't know.
I think this is a pretty sophisticated and disciplined bunch of a group. And I suspect if you try from 4:30 to 5 o'clock to see if they can only unmute themselves when they're called upon to, and then remute themselves afterwards, they might show enough discipline that you don't have to go through all this bureaucracy of worrying about whether you have to hit the unmute button. You should try it for one meeting, I think, just from 4:30 to 5.
The problem is, though, if there's only 2 or 3 people that don't do it, and they have an argument in the background or something, then you have to find out.
You have the power to mute them.
We mute them.
Yeah.
You can mute people in a second.
Sometimes
that's a good
because my experience from our other group is there'll be some noise, some background noise or radio or something, and then you have to figure out which person is that coming from.
There's no way to tell where the static is coming from. That is such a pain in the ass for me, and that happens like periodically.
But I was saying, such a disciplined group that they might be good enough to speak and then remute. That's the secret of a well-disciplined group of people.
And anybody who's not speaking, everybody who's unmuted shows up at the top of the list. And I mean, I've done this before in other meetings. It's like, if you're not speaking, but you haven't muted yourself, I mute you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good bunch of people. You might try letting them free.
Ultimately it's Ken's decision, but I'm with David. I'm with David that we risk experimenting.
Yeah. This is an experimental thing, and I think we've seen now. You said at the max there were just 60 something or
62.
62?
66 you saw?
I think I saw 66. I saw someone
that's closer to right, yeah.
And of course there may be a few people that came and left, and then other people came later or something.
Sure, there were.
So that
but most people
I'm guessing that
until
means maybe 70 something people were there for some point or other. So that makes it a little bit simpler. We'll see how it develops, but
I thought it went pretty well for the most part.
I discovered that some people figured out that once you get unmuted in order to ask your question, you're unmuted for the rest of the meeting. It was kind of handy just to ask a question so you could stay unmuted.
I muted a few people.
Okay, so that has to be, like when
Think about it.
the next person, the previous person gets muted again.
So in pinning, you're going to need one person to pin. If you want a split screen, you're going to have to assign somebody also to pin the person speaking, and then to unpin them when they're done. And that
being to specify, like,
if you want a split
person
screen, yeah,
want to
if you
hear.
Well,
want
of course,
both people on the screen.
Zoom will do that on its own if people are being fairly disciplined. Zoom knows who's speaking and gives, if you say pin the speaker, you can see just the person speaking. That's another choice. Let Zoom do
I'd
it.
love to see how you do that. Actually, if you could show me how to do that, that would be great.
That's the normal setting.
Actually, during the
people have to then
question,
decide themselves to
Yeah.
pin the speaker. Every individual has to pin the speaker for that to work.
yeah, during the questions, I was not seeing my image, and then somebody said, well, click the speaker view, but the speaker view was already on. I had never taken it off, but I still wasn't like, okay, I just did that now, and now I'm seeing only myself. Oh, I need to stop the recording.
No, I just experimented with Spotlight for everyone, and